This photograph was taken somewhere in Europe, sometime near the very end of World War II. The exact date is uncertain. The name of the photographer is lost. What remains is the moment. Who are these women, kneeling in the mud, their faces streaked with dirt and terror? Why is one of them screaming toward the sky while another lies motionless at her knees? Why do two armed soldiers stand behind them, watching, waiting, unmoving? Look closely. This is not a battlefield in motion. This is what comes after the fighting stops. Were these women soldiers or prisoners? Are they grieving a death or witnessing something worse? And most unsettling of all, what happened just seconds before this image was frozen in time? This photograph does not show violence. It shows the moment before the truth becomes unbearable. And once you understand what you're really looking at, you may never forget it. September 22, 1945. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The shouting started before anyone saw what was happening. It tore through Barrack 7 in sharp, panicked bursts of German and broken English, voices overlapping, climbing over one another, cracking under strain. "Don't touch her! She's dying! Stay back!" Inside the long wooden barracks, 40 German women had formed a wall. Not a line, not a circle, a wall. They stood shoulder to shoulder, 3 bodies deep, backs pressed to bunks and support beams, faces rigid with fear and fury. Some clutched broom handles like clubs. Others gripped tin cups, chair legs, anything their hands had found in the first blind seconds of terror. Their knuckles were white. Their arms trembled, but none of them stepped aside. At the center of that wall, on the lowest bunk near the far corner, lay a woman who was no longer breathing. Her name was Greta Miller. She was 32 years old, a former Luftwaffe communications officer, tall even now as she lay collapsed and gray against the thin mattress. Her lips had turned blue. Her chest did not rise. Her eyes were half open, unfocused, already drifting somewhere the others could not follow. They believed they were protecting her. That was the terrible irony of it. Outside the barracks, Camp Ruston sounded nothing like a place where someone was dying. A radio played softly at the guard station. Jazz, light and lazy, the kind of music that wandered rather than marched. A truck rumbled past on the gravel road, its engine steady, unhurried, carrying supplies from one end of the camp to the other. Somewhere beyond the trees, a pair of American soldiers laughed at a private joke, their voices loose with the unfamiliar relief of peacetime. War, at least for them, was over. Inside Barrack 7, it had never felt further away. The American medical team reached the doorway and stopped short. Captain James Morrison, the camp's chief medical officer, took in the scene in a single stunned glance. The wall of women, the improvised weapons, the wild eyes, the body on, the bunk beyond them. He raised both hands slowly, palms open, a gesture meant to calm men on battlefields and patients in shock alike. "We're here to help," he said, loud enough to cut through the shouting. The women surged forward as one. "Don't come closer. You won't touch her. You'll kill her." They screamed it with the conviction of people who believed they were speaking absolute truth. Morrison froze, 1 foot half a step inside the doorway. Behind him, Corporal Danny Martinez tightened his grip on the stretcher. Private First Class Sarah Chen stood slightly to the side, her medical kit still slung over her shoulder, eyes moving quickly from face to face. The air inside the barracks was thick, pine wood, disinfectant, sweat, fear. Heat pressed down from the low ceiling, trapped there all summer, unwilling to leave even though September had come. A fly buzzed near the window screen, oblivious to the crisis unfolding beneath it. The shouting grew louder. They weren't asking the Americans to save Greta. They were daring them not to try. This was not how captivity was supposed to look. 3 months earlier, Germany had collapsed. Cities lay in rubble. Radios had gone silent. Orders had stopped coming. And yet here, thousands of miles away, in the pine forests of northern Louisiana, the machinery of America still turned. Camp Ruston had not shut down when the war ended. The guards still stood watch. The kitchens still served meals. The infirmary still stocked its cabinets with medicines that most of Europe could no longer dream of finding. The rules still applied. The clocks still ran. For the Americans, this place had already begun to feel like something temporary, a duty to be finished before going home. Many of the guards were counting days, not weeks. They talked about wives waiting in Iowa and Ohio, about college on the GI Bill, about jobs they'd left behind and lives they were eager to pick up again. For the German women, time had frozen. They lived in the narrow space between defeat and return, between a past that had collapsed and a future they could not imagine. They were prisoners of a war that was technically over, trapped not by barbed wire alone, but by everything they had been taught to believe. Beliefs that now stood between Greta and the people who could save her. On the bunk, Helga Weiss leaned over her friend's body, her ear pressed to Greta's chest. Helga had been an army nurse on the Eastern Front. She knew the signs. She had seen men drown in their own lungs, had watched fever steal breath inch by inch. "She's gone," someone whispered behind her. Helga shook her head violently. "No," she said, though her voice wavered. "No." She tilted Greta's head back, pinched her nose, and sealed her mouth over Greta's. She breathed once, twice, 3 times. Greta's chest rose only because Helga forced it to. Nothing came back. "Help her!" A woman screamed, not at the Americans, but at Helga, at fate, at God. From the doorway, Morrison could see the color of Greta's lips, the stillness of her body. He knew what seconds meant in moments like this. He took a careful step forward. The wall surged again. Metal clanged against wood. A chair leg swung up, then stopped inches from his chest. "You will not experiment on her," one woman shouted in English, her accent thick, her terror unmistakable. Experiment. The word landed heavily in the narrow room. Morrison felt it then. The depth of their fear, the conviction that whatever he carried in his hands was worse than death itself. Outside, the radio shifted songs. A trumpet slid into a smooth, careless note. Inside, Helga broke. "She's not breathing," she cried, her voice splintering as she forced air into Greta's lungs again. "Please, please." Lisa Schreiber, younger than the others, her face pale with panic, pushed her way out of the knot of women around the bunk. She looked once at Greta's unmoving body, once at Helga's frantic efforts, and made her decision. She ran. Her boots pounded across the wooden floor, through the doorway, past the stunned Americans, and out into the bright Louisiana afternoon. "Doctor!" she screamed, her English falling apart as she ran. "Help! Woman dying! Please!" Inside Barracks 7, Greta Miller did not breathe. Helga pressed her mouth to Greta's again, her tears falling onto her friend's face as she forced air into lungs that no longer answered. At the doorway, the American stood frozen between 2 truths. One step forward might save a life. One step forward might ignite violence. The barracks held its breath. And for a moment, just one, the question hung in the air, heavier than fear itself. Would Greta Miller die because of what they believed, or live because someone dared to challenge it? The fear did not begin in Louisiana. It did not begin in Camp Ruston or in the wooden barracks. or even in the moment Greta collapsed onto the bunk. It began years earlier, in darkened rooms back in Germany, where film projectors hummed and flickered and told them what to believe. They had been shown what Americans were, at least what they were told Americans were. In the newsreel rooms and training halls, the images came relentlessly. American doctors in white coats standing over helpless prisoners, scalpels gleaming under harsh lights. Narrators spoke in calm, authoritative voices about medical experiments, about enemies treated not as patients but as raw material. The films lingered on needles, restraints, men strapped to tables. The message was never subtle. If you are captured, you will not be healed. You will be used. For the women, the warnings were even darker. They were told American men were undisciplined, driven by appetite and impulse, that German women taken prisoner would be humiliated, violated, stripped of dignity as punishment for who they were and what they represented. The films showed shadowy figures, grasping hands, laughing faces meant to disgust and terrify. Better to die, the instructors said, than to fall into American hands. The message repeated itself until it settled deep into bone and muscle, until it stopped sounding like propaganda and started sounding like simple fact. By the time the war ended, the women no longer remembered when they had first learned to fear America. It felt as old and unquestioned as gravity. None of them had been frontline soldiers. They were Helferinnen, female auxiliaries. Radio operators hunched over headsets for hours, fingers moving across dials as voices crackled in and out. Clerks who typed orders, filed reports, tracked supplies. Nurses who changed bandages, held hands, and learned how quickly blood could soak through cloth. They had not fired rifles. They had not stormed beaches. But when Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, none of that mattered. They were captured all the same. They were processed, herded, transported. First through makeshift holding camps in Europe, where fences went up faster than latrines and rumors spread faster than food. Then onto ships crossing an ocean they had been told would become their grave. By the time they reached America, fear was not an emotion anymore. It was a condition. Many of them had survived the final months of the war in Germany by hiding underground. Basements that smelled of mold and damp stone. Cellars where air barely moved and candles burned low to conserve oxygen. They remembered the sound of bombs not as explosions, but as pressure, something that pressed down through layers of earth and rattled teeth in their skulls. They remembered retreat, the endless movement westward, always away from something worse. Roads choked with refugees, soldiers without units, horses collapsing in the mud, the sky full of aircraft they could no longer fight. They remembered hospitals without medicine, wounded men laid out on straw because beds were gone, surgeons washing their hands with water that barely ran, nurses tearing sheets into strips because there were no bandages left, infections that would have been trivial once, now fatal. By the time the women were captured, sickness no longer felt treatable. It felt like a sentence. So when Greta arrived at Camp Rustin and smelled disinfectant, sharp, clean, unmistakable, it unsettled her more than comforted her. The scent did not mean safety to her. It meant procedures, needles, tables, control. The barracks themselves were wrong. They were too clean, too orderly, built of fresh pine instead of rotting boards. Windows had glass that closed properly. Mattresses were thin but real. Blankets were rough wool, not rags. Nothing about it matched the prison she had imagined. That was what made it dangerous. At night, instead of sirens, there were crickets. They sang so loudly it felt like noise pressed into the air, a constant vibration that never let the silence settle. Greta lay awake on her bunk listening to them, convinced that such sound could only exist because something was being hidden beneath it. During the day, guards joked with one another. They leaned against posts instead of pacing. They laughed. Sometimes they argued about baseball teams or complained about the heat. They did not shout orders unless necessary. They did not strike anyone. The women watched all of it with narrowed eyes. Cruelty, they believed, was coming later. It had to be. The absence of visible violence did not reassure them. It made them suspicious. In Germany, nothing kind came without a cost. Nothing orderly existed without punishment behind it. This, they told themselves, was how Americans prepared their experiments. Greta was among the most rigid in her certainty. She had been a senior communications officer in the Luftwaffe, trained to distrust anything that sounded too calm, too controlled. In her world, silence often meant an ambush. Precision often meant annihilation. She spoke little to the guards. When she did, her tone was clipped, formal, distant. She followed orders exactly, not out of respect, but because precision was her armor. When she developed a cough in early September, she said nothing. The Louisiana air was thick and wet, nothing like the dry cold she knew. She told herself it was irritation, a reaction. Weakness, maybe, but not danger. Helga noticed anyway. Helga always noticed. She had worked in field hospitals where men learned to read their own bodies as warnings. She recognized the way Greta's cough sounded. Too deep, too persistent. She saw the way fever glazed Greta's eyes and flushed her cheeks. "You need the infirmary," Helga said quietly one night as they sat on their bunks. Greta shook her head without hesitation. "No. You can't treat pneumonia with water and blankets. I won't let them touch me." Helga did not argue at first. She knew what Greta meant without explanation. The infirmary was American. It meant doctors. It meant needles. It meant becoming helpless in front of people Greta had been taught were not healers at all. "They experiment," Greta said later, her voice hoarse. "They practice on prisoners. They let you die so they can see what happens." Helga tried reason. "I treated soldiers on the Eastern Front," she said. "I've seen men die without antibiotics. This is the same." Greta's eyes hardened. "I would rather die here." She did not say it dramatically. There was no tremor in her voice. It was a statement of fact. To Greta, allowing American doctors to take control of her body was worse than death because death, at least, could not humiliate her. Death could not turn her into proof of everything she feared. As her condition worsened, the camp's normality became unbearable. The jazz on the radio sounded obscene. The laughter of guards sounded fake. The trucks delivering supplies felt like props in a performance designed to lower defenses. Greta began to see intention in everything. Why were the guards so relaxed? Why was there always medicine available? Why did no one need chains? Order without fear was alien to her. A system that functioned without constant violence did not make sense, and when something made no sense, it had to be dangerous. By the time she could no longer sleep without gasping for breath, Greta's decision was fixed. She would not go to the infirmary. She would not give them the chance. Helga knew what that meant. She watched Greta's fever climb. She counted breaths that grew shallower, faster. She recognized the sound of fluid in the lungs, the rattle that no amount of willpower could stop. She also knew what the Americans had in their infirmary: antibiotics, oxygen, equipment she had not seen in years. The knowledge tore at her. When Greta whispered, "Promise me," Helga promised. And as Greta's body failed, Helga understood the full cruelty of what propaganda had done. It had not only taught them who to fear, it had taught them to choose death over the possibility that they had been lied to. By the time Greta collapsed during roll call, Helga already knew the truth. Without medicine, Greta would die. But with medicine, American medicine, Greta might never forgive her. As Helga pressed her mouth to Greta's and forced air into lungs that refused to work, she felt the terrible weight of that choice settle over her. Fear had done its work perfectly. It had made death feel safer than trust, and it was winning. In September of 1945, America was learning how to stand down without falling apart. Across the country, factories that had run day and night were slowing their lines. Planes no longer rolled off assembly floors at wartime speed. Men who had lived for years by orders and timetables began thinking about classrooms, kitchens, front porches, but the systems built to win the war did not vanish overnight. They kept running. At Camp Ruston, trucks still arrived each morning, their tires crunching over gravel roads with practiced regularity. They carried crates of supplies, medical kits, canned food, linens, fuel, items stamped and logged and distributed without ceremony. The war might have ended, but logistics did not stop simply because the guns went quiet. The kitchens opened on schedule. Coffee was brewed in dented metal urns, strong and bitter, poured into chipped cups by men who no longer flinched at loud noises. Bread was sliced. Pots were scrubbed. The work continued because it always had. In the infirmary, cabinets remained stocked. Bottles of penicillin sat labeled and sealed. Oxygen tanks waited along the wall, their valves gleaming faintly under fluorescent lights. Sterile instruments lay wrapped and ready, untouched but maintained. The base hospital, a solid structure of brick and concrete beyond the camp, perimeter hummed with electricity and routine. Corridors were lit, floors were waxed, sheets were changed. This was not abundance flaunted. It was competence sustained. The women in the POW compound noticed everything. They saw the trucks. They smelled the food. They watched guards drink coffee and complain about the heat. They saw doctors and nurses move in and out of buildings with the casual confidence of people who expected systems to work when called upon. It did not reassure them. It frightened them. To women who had come from a world where hospitals had run out of morphine and soap had become a luxury, this level of order felt unnatural. In their experience, resources were always hoarded, rationed, weaponized. You did not give medical care to enemies unless there was something to gain. Yet here it was, simply existing. The women spoke about it quietly at night. Why so much medicine? Why so many nurses? Why build hospitals for prisoners? There had to be a reason, and if there was a reason, it could not be good. Captain James Morrison had been at Camp Ruston for nearly a year. Before that, he had served in field hospitals in France, then Germany, moving east with the armies, setting up operating rooms in schools, churches, half-collapsed buildings. He had learned to work with what he had, to improvise, to make decisions fast and live with them forever. Ruston felt strange to him at first. Too quiet, too clean. No artillery in the distance, no wounded arriving in waves, just routine illnesses, accidents, the occasional injury from work details, prisoners who needed care, guards who needed care, civilians who sometimes wandered in from nearby towns. He still wore his uniform in the same way he had during the war, still checked supplies out of habit, still carried the weight of what he had seen. But here, medicine felt less like triage and more like maintenance. When the call came that afternoon, woman down in the POW barracks, he had been sitting halfway through dinner. The mess hall smelled of coffee and starch. A radio played softly near the far wall. Morrison had a napkin tucked into his collar, an old habit from operating rooms he hadn't broken yet. He stood up immediately, chair scraping the floor. "Medical team," he said. "Now." Corporal Martinez was already on his feet. Sarah Chen followed close behind, slipping her arms into her jacket as she moved. Sarah had been assigned to the women's compound for a simple reason. Someone, somewhere in the chain of command, had thought it might help. Female prisoners, the logic went, might respond better to another woman. They might speak more freely. They might feel less threatened. It was not written in any medical textbook, but it made sense to people who valued practical solutions. It was a small decision, but it said something about how America handled power. Sarah was 24, small-framed, her dark hair pinned neatly back. She had fought to get into medical training when many believed women had no place near the front lines of care. She carried herself with quiet competence, unshowy, focused. She did not talk much about herself. She simply did the work. As they crossed the camp yard at a run, Morrison noticed the familiar details that anchored him. The smell of pine, the hard-packed dirt beneath his boots, the low hum of generators. He had walked this path dozens of times. Nothing about it suggested danger, until they reached Barracks 7. The noise hit first, shouting, screaming, the raw sound of panic compressed into a narrow space. Morrison slowed instinctively as he reached the doorway, and stopped. The scene inside did not resemble anything he had expected. The women had not scattered. They had not backed away. They had organized. 40 bodies packed tight, faces pale and furious, arms raised not in surrender but in warning, their eyes fixed on him with a clarity born of absolute certainty. He saw weapons where there should have been nothing. Broom handles, cups, broken furniture. He saw fear sharpened into something dangerous, and beyond them, barely visible, a still body on a bunk. Morrison felt the calculation begin automatically. Distance, time, escalation. He could call for guards. They could force their way in. He could reach the patient eventually, but not without consequences. Force would confirm every nightmare these women carried, and it would take time Greta did not have. Behind him, Martinez waited, muscles tense, eyes alert. Sarah shifted slightly, reading the room in a way Morrison recognized. She was watching hands, not faces. The women screamed again. "Don't touch her! Stay back!" Morrison raised his hands. "We're here to help," he said. The words sounded thin in the chaos. He understood something then, not as a theory, but as fact. This was not defiance. This was terror. They were not protecting Greta from him because they hated him. They were protecting her because they believed he was worse than death. The systems Morrison trusted, the oath, the training, the equipment, meant nothing to people who had been taught a different story. Outside the barracks, life continued. A truck idled briefly, then moved on. Someone laughed. The radio carried on, careless and alive. Inside, Morrison stood at the edge of a line that could not be crossed with orders. He did not reach for his authority. He did not signal for force. He stayed where he was. And in that pause, brief, deliberate, he made a choice that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with who he believed America was meant to be. If he was going to save the woman on that bunk, it would not be by overpowering fear. It would have to be by dismantling it. Slowly, carefully, one step at a time. The wall moved, not backward, forward. The women pressed closer together, bodies tightening into one solid mass, the narrow aisle of the barracks disappearing beneath their feet. Broom handles lifted higher. A metal cup clanged against a bunk frame as someone's hand shook too hard to hold it steady. Captain Morrison felt time compress. The room was no longer measured in minutes or seconds, but in breaths. He could hear them now, short, ragged, uneven, coming from behind the wall, where Helga still knelt over Greta's body. "She's drowning," he thought. He knew the sound. He had heard it in Normandy, in bombed-out farmhouses, in men whose lungs filled faster than hands could help. He did not need to see Greta clearly to know how close she was to dying. "Sir," Martinez said quietly at his shoulder, "we should call for backup." It was not a challenge. It was a calculation. A few guards, enough force to clear a path, enough authority to break the standoff. Morrison did not turn his head. "No," he said immediately. Martinez hesitated. "Sir, if this gets worse—" "It will get worse," Morrison said. "If we do that—" He finally looked back, meeting Martinez's eyes. "Look at them. They don't think we're doctors. They think we're executioners." Martinez followed his gaze. He saw what Morrison saw now. Not criminals, not enemies in any conventional sense, but women whose fear had hardened into something desperate and dangerous. "If we force our way in," Morrison continued, "we prove them right, and she dies while we're fighting our way through." Another shout erupted from the wall. "Stay back! Don't come closer!" One of the women lunged forward half a step, chair leg raised, eyes wild. Morrison raised his hands higher, palms open, fingers spread. "We're doctors," he said again, louder this time. "We want to help your friend." A voice cut through in English, sharp and accusatory. "You want to use her." Someone else took it up in German, the words tumbling over one another. Experiment, torture, death. Behind the wall, Helga forced air into Greta's lungs again. Once, twice. The sound was wrong, wet, bubbling, desperate. Morrison's chest tightened. He leaned slightly toward Sarah Chen. "Sarah," he said softly, "I need you." She did not ask what he meant. She had already understood. Sarah stepped forward. She did not carry her medical kit. She set it down carefully at her feet, as if it were something that might frighten them. She raised both hands, empty, and moved one pace ahead of Morrison. The women froze. Not because she was commanding, because she was not. Sarah was small compared to many of them. Younger, her face held no anger, no challenge, only focus, and something else, something Morrison recognized from long nights in hospital wards, urgency without panic. "My name is Sarah," she said slowly, clearly. "I'm a nurse." The word nurse landed differently than doctor. There was a ripple through the wall. Not movement. Attention. "I have medicine," Sarah continued, gesturing gently toward the kit on the floor. "Medicine to help your friend breathe." A woman near the front laughed bitterly. "Lies." Sarah did not respond to the insult. She crouched slightly instead, lowering herself to their level, careful not to appear submissive or threatening. "She's not breathing," Sarah said. "I can help her breathe." She demonstrated with her hands, slowly, deliberately. Inhale, exhale, the universal language of the body. At the front of the wall, Lisa watched her. Lisa had been standing there since she ran back from the guard station, breath still burning in her chest. She had screamed for help because she had run out of choices. Now she stood between the terror she had known all her life and the possibility, terrifying in its own way, that everything she believed might be wrong. She studied Sarah's face. This woman did not look like the monsters from the films. There was no hunger in her eyes, no calculation, only strain, the strain of someone racing a clock that could not be stopped. Lisa turned slightly, speaking quickly in German to the women behind her. "Look at her," she said. "Look at her eyes." "They're pretending," someone hissed. "Pretending what?" Lisa snapped back. "To care? For what purpose? Greta is dying now. Right now." A woman near the back began to cry. "They will hurt her." "She's already being hurt," Lisa said, her voice breaking. "She hasn't breathed in minutes." Helga's sob cut through the argument. "I can't keep her alive," she cried. "I can't." The words hit the wall like a crack. Sarah took another step forward. One of the older women lunged out suddenly and grabbed her arm. The barracks went silent. The woman's grip was iron hard, her face lined and rigid, eyes blazing with fury and fear. She spoke rapidly in German, her words sharp enough to cut. Lisa translated without looking away. She says, "If you hurt her, if you experiment, if you cause her pain, we will kill you, all of us. We don't care what happens to us." The threat hung in the air, naked and unmistakable. Sarah did not pull away. She looked at the woman holding her arm and nodded once. "I understand," she said quietly. "If I hurt her, you can kill me." The simplicity of it stunned the room. Sarah met the woman's gaze and did not look away. "But I won't hurt her. I promise." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the woman released her grip. The wall did not collapse. It shifted. A single gap opened, narrow at first, just enough space for one person to pass. Then another woman stepped aside. Then another. The opening widened, no more than 2 shoulders across. The women did not lower their weapons. They did not relax. They watched. Sarah stepped through the gap. Morrison followed immediately, Martinez close behind, equipment lifted and ready. As they passed into the circle, the women closed ranks behind them. Now the Americans were surrounded. If this went wrong, there would be no retreat. Morrison knelt beside Greta's bunk. Up close, the damage was unmistakable. Her lips were blue, her skin clammy. Her chest still except for the forced movement Helga created with each desperate breath. "She's in respiratory failure," Morrison said, already working. "Severe pneumonia." Helga looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "Please," she whispered, the only English word she could find. Morrison placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. "You did good," he said. "Now let us help." Martinez moved with practiced speed, setting up an IV. Sarah handed Morrison the intubation kit. The oxygen bag was ready in seconds. The women watched in stunned silence. They had expected violence. They saw precision. Hands moved gently, efficiently. Orders were short, calm, exact. There was no shouting, no cruelty, no spectacle, just 3 people doing their jobs with absolute focus. Morrison slid the tube into Greta's airway and nodded to Martinez. "Bag her." Martinez squeezed. Air flowed. Once, twice. On the 3rd compression, Greta's chest rose and fell. Not from Helga's effort, but from the machine of human care working exactly as it was meant to. Sarah administered the injection. Penicillin, clear and unremarkable in the syringe, a miracle distilled into liquid form. For 3 minutes, nothing changed. Then Greta coughed. It was weak, barely a sound, but it was hers. Morrison felt it before he saw it. The shift, the release. Color began to creep back into Greta's face, faint but undeniable. "She's responding," he said softly. Around them, the wall dissolved. Women sank to the floor, legs giving out. Others clutched one another, sobbing. A few stood frozen, staring at the scene as if watching the ground move beneath their feet. The lie they had lived with for years cracked open in real time. They had built a wall to protect their friend from monsters. Instead, they had nearly killed her by believing they existed. As Greta's breathing steadied under the steady rhythm of the oxygen bag, Morrison allowed himself one small breath of relief. They had crossed the line. And, for the first time, the wall had opened. Not because it was forced, but because fear had finally met something stronger than itself. Martinez was already kneeling, tourniquet tight, vein found on the first try. The needle slid in clean. Clear fluid rushed down the line, gravity-fed, relentless. Morrison did not look up. He did not need to. He trusted the hands beside him. Oxygen! The bag was there. Martinez squeezed, once, twice. The rhythm was steady, practiced, not hurried, not gentle either, purposeful. Air went in. Greta did not breathe it back. Helga watched from inches away, her body trembling so hard she had to brace one hand against the bunk frame. Her mouth opened, then closed. She did not dare make a sound. She counted squeezes instead. 1, 2, 3. Morrison's fingers were already working at Greta's jaw, tilting her head, clearing the airway. He moved with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this under shell fire, under screaming, under lights that flickered and died. Tube, he said. Sarah placed it into his hand without a word. The room had gone utterly silent. 40 women stood packed together, breath held, eyes fixed on hands instead of faces. No one screamed now. No one threatened. The weapons lay forgotten on the floor. They had expected brutality. They saw precision. The tube slid into place. Morrison nodded once. Bag. Martinez squeezed again. This time, Greta's chest rose more fully. The movement no longer forced, but guided. Morrison watched her lips, the color that had drained from them creeping back by degrees too small to believe in yet. Adrenaline, he said. Sarah drew it up. Her hands were steady. Helga swayed. Lisa caught her before she fell, arms wrapping around her shoulders, holding her upright. Helga's knees buckled anyway. She sank to the floor, sobbing now, soundless and shaking, her face buried against Lisa's side. I couldn't, Helga whispered. I couldn't. Lisa pressed her forehead to Helga's hair. You did, she said. You kept her alive. Morrison leaned in close to Greta's face, listening, watching. The rattle was still there, wet, dangerous, but it was softer now, less frantic. He placed his fingers against her neck. The pulse was there, thin, weak, but there. Penicillin, he said. Sarah injected it smoothly into the line. There was nothing dramatic about it. No flash, no ceremony. Just a clear liquid disappearing into tubing, carried by blood to places that desperately needed it. Minutes earlier, Greta Miller had been dying. Now, she was being fought for. The bag rose and fell, each squeeze a refusal to let go. Morrison spoke quietly as he worked, his voice low and steady, meant for the woman on the bunk, even if she could not hear him. You're doing fine, he said. That's it. Let the air in. It was not a command. It was encouragement. For a long moment, nothing happened. The women waited for pain, for thrashing, for something ugly. Instead, Greta coughed. It was a weak sound, barely more than a reflex, but it tore through the room like a thunderclap. Her body jerked slightly. Morrison stiffened, then smiled despite himself. There, he said softly. That's good. He adjusted the tube. Martinez kept the rhythm. Greta's lips shifted from blue to gray, then to something faintly human again. Color crept back into her cheeks, uneven and fragile, but real. Her eyelids fluttered. Helga lifted her head from Lisa's shoulder, eyes wide, unbelieving. Greta? She whispered. Greta's eyes opened. They did not focus at first. They drifted, unfixed, then stilled. Her gaze landed somewhere near the ceiling, then slid down to Morrison's face hovering above her. Confusion passed through her features, fear, then exhaustion. She tried to speak. Morrison pressed a finger gently to her lips. "Easy," he said. "Don't try yet." Tears spilled from Helga's eyes freely now. She crawled forward on her knees, stopping only when Sarah raised a hand slightly, not in warning, but in care. "Give us a moment," Sarah said softly. Helga nodded, unable to speak. Around them, the women began to cry. Not sharp, hysterical cries. Something else, the sound of a dam breaking. Some covered their mouths. Others clutched each other and sank to the floor. A few stood rigid, tears tracking down their faces as they stared at Greta's chest rising and falling under American hands. They had believed a lie for so long that it had shaped their instincts. And now they were watching that lie dissolve in real time. Morrison checked Greta's vitals again. Better. Not good, but better. "She's stable," he said, "for now." The words were quiet, almost understated, but they rippled through the room like a promise. "We need to move her," he continued. "She needs the hospital." No one argued. When Martinez lifted Greta carefully onto the stretcher, hands reached out instinctively and then stopped. The women stepped back instead, creating space where moments earlier there had been none. The wall did not resist this time. It parted. Helga rose unsteadily to her feet. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at Morrison with an expression he had seen on battlefields before. Raw gratitude mixed with disbelief. "Thank you," she said in halting English. "Thank you." Morrison nodded once. "You're welcome." As the stretcher moved toward the door, the women followed in silence, forming a corridor rather than a barrier. Greta's hand twitched as they passed, fingers curling weakly. Helga reached out, touching it briefly, reverently. "Stay," she whispered. "Stay." Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding after the dim barracks. The air smelled of pine and dust and something faintly sweet. The radio at the guard station still played, oblivious. The stretcher moved quickly now, boots pounding, purpose restored. Morrison walked alongside, one hand steadying the oxygen bag, eyes never leaving Greta's face. Behind them, the women stopped at the barracks doorway. None of them crossed the threshold. They stood together, watching as the Americans carried their friend away, not as a subject, not as a prisoner, but as a patient. When the stretcher disappeared down the path toward the hospital, Helga exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Lisa looked around at the women clustered beside her. "We were wrong," she said quietly. No one argued. The truth sat heavy and undeniable between them. They had built a wall to keep monsters out. Instead, they had watched mercy walk in, calm, competent, and unarmed. And it had saved a life. The hospital did not look like a battlefield. That was the first thing Helga noticed as she stepped through its doors. The lights were bright, steady, electric, humming softly overhead. Not candles, not lanterns. Real lights that did not flicker when someone walked past. The air smelled clean, sharp with soap and antiseptic. Floors shone faintly where they had been scrubbed and waxed, reflecting shoes moving with purpose down the corridor. Order lived here. Greta was wheeled away through double doors marked emergency. Her stretcher guided smoothly between walls that bore no cracks, no soot, no scars of shell fire. Nurses moved past in crisp uniforms, charts tucked under arms, their steps quick but unhurried. Voices stayed low. Instructions were given once and followed. No shouting, no chaos, no fear-driven improvisation. Helga stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the simple shock of it. She had worked in the hospitals before, or what had passed for hospitals in the last year of the war. Places where beds were scarce, where men lay on floors, where doctors chose who might live and who would not because there were not enough supplies for everyone. This place was different. Here, no one argued over resources. No one begged for morphine. No one tore bandages into smaller strips to make them last. Here, the system assumed it would work. Greta was placed in a clean bed with white sheets pulled tight and smooth. Tubes and lines were adjusted carefully. An oxygen machine hissed softly, steady as breathing itself. A nurse checked Greta's vitals and nodded once, then moved on. "She'll be okay," someone said quietly. Helga sank onto a wooden bench along the wall, her legs giving out beneath her. Lisa sat beside her, both women still in their camp uniforms, still prisoners, but for the moment indistinguishable from anyone else waiting on news about someone they loved. They were just people in a hospital. Time passed differently there. Minutes felt longer, heavier. The hallway remained busy but calm, the rhythm of footsteps constant. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. A cart rattled softly. The world continued, held together by routine. Captain Morrison emerged nearly an hour later. His shoulders were slumped now, fatigue finally catching up to him. But when he saw Helga and Lisa rise from the bench, his expression softened. "She's going to live," he said. Lisa translated, her voice breaking halfway through the sentence. Helga covered her mouth with both hands and began to cry again, this time without restraint. "The pneumonia is severe," Morrison continued, "but we caught it in time. We'll keep her here for a while. Antibiotics, oxygen, rest." Helga nodded repeatedly, as if afraid the words might vanish if she stopped acknowledging them. They were allowed to see Greta, briefly. She lay unconscious, a tube still helping her breathe. Color returned to her face. Machines clicked and hummed beside the bed, indifferent and dependable. The gray pallor that had frightened them so deeply was gone. Helga reached out and touched Greta's hand. It was warm, alive. When they left the room, Morrison gestured toward the hospital cafeteria. He bought them coffee and sandwiches, setting the tray down between them without comment. They accepted hesitantly, unsure of the rules of this strange new space where enemies sat together without guards. Morrison watched them for a moment, then spoke. "There's something I want to understand," he said. "Why did you think we would hurt her?" The question was simple. It landed heavily. Lisa stared down at her cup. Helga folded her hands tightly in her lap. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Lisa answered. "In Germany," she said slowly, choosing her words, "we were shown films, stories, about American doctors, that they experiment on prisoners, that they don't care if people die." Morrison's jaw tightened. Not in anger, something deeper. "That's not true," he said. "Not even close." He leaned back slightly. "I took an oath when I became a doctor. First, do no harm. It doesn't matter who the patient is, American, German, soldier, prisoner. When someone needs care, we provide it." Lisa hesitated. "But why?" Morrison considered her question carefully. "Because there are rules," he said. "Laws, the Geneva Convention. You have the right to medical care, adequate food, shelter, dignity." He met their eyes. "These aren't favors, they're obligations." Helga looked up at him then. "Even for us?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Morrison said without hesitation. The certainty in his voice unsettled her. She had lived under a system where rules bent to power, where laws served ideology, where obedience mattered more than humanity. here was a man telling her that power was restrained by choice, not fear. "Why?" Lisa asked again. "You won. You could do whatever you want." Morrison smiled faintly. "Because power without rules is tyranny, and because how we treat people when we don't have to, that's who we really are." The words stayed with them long after they returned to Camp Ruston. Back in Barrack 7, the women crowded around Helga and Lisa as soon as they entered. Questions flew from every direction. Is she alive? What did they do? Did they hurt her? Lisa climbed onto a chair so they could all see her. "They saved her," she said. "They didn't hurt her. They treated her like anyone else." Murmurs rippled through the room. Relief, doubt, disbelief. An older woman crossed her arms tightly. "Maybe they are pretending," she said. "Maybe this is different because she almost died." Helga spoke then, her voice steady despite the exhaustion weighing on her. "I saw the hospital," she said. "I saw the machines, the medicine. They could have done nothing. They chose not to." Silence followed. Not agreement, something heavier. If this was true, then the world was not what they had been taught. Over the next days, the story spread. The women began to notice things they had dismissed before. Guards who greeted them politely. Doctors who explained procedures. Rules that were followed even when no one seemed to be watching. A lecture was announced a week later. Captain Morrison stood before the assembled women and explained their rights under international law. Food, water, medical care, letters home. One woman raised her hand. "Why follow these rules?" she asked. "Why not just do what you want?" Morrison answered without raising his voice. "Because civilization depends on restraint," he said. "Because the measure of a country is not how it treats its friends, but how it treats those who can't fight back." The words landed differently now. That night, as the women lay on their bunks listening to the crickets outside and the distant hum of generators, a thought began to circulate quietly from one whispered conversation to another. If the Americans were not monsters, if they followed rules even when they had power, if they treated enemies with dignity, then what did that say about everything else? In the dim light of Barrack 7, someone finally said what many had been thinking. "Maybe," she whispered, "everything our government told us was a lie." Greta Miller returned to Camp Ruston 12 days later. She walked slowly, thinner than before, but upright. Color had returned to her face. Her breathing was still careful, measured, but it was her own. When she stepped into Barrack 7, the room went silent for a heartbeat and then broke apart in motion. Women stood, hands reached out. Someone laughed through tears. Someone else cried openly, unashamed. Greta raised a hand, asking for quiet. She looked older than when she had left, not from sickness, but from something heavier. She stood in the center of the barracks, shoulders squared, eyes steady. "I was wrong," she said. No explanations followed, no excuses. Just the truth, spoken plainly by the woman who had once trusted no one. "They saved my life," Greta continued. "They treated me with care. They explained what they were doing. They asked before they touched me. I was afraid of lies, and I almost died because I believed them." She paused, swallowing hard. "I would have died hating people who didn't deserve it." Something shifted then. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. The women began to change. Not all at once, not all in the same way, but fear loosened its grip. Some started learning English phrases, practicing them hesitantly with guards who smiled and corrected their pronunciation. Conversations formed where silence had ruled. Questions replaced suspicion. Private Sarah Chen became a familiar presence in the women's compound. She brought supplies, she taught basic first aid, she played cards, she listened, she spoke honestly, too, about America's ideals and its failures, about discrimination she herself had faced, about a country still struggling to become what it claimed to be. The women listened closely. They had grown up on certainty. This complexity was new. One evening, a letter arrived for Greta from Munich. It was thin, creased, written in cramped handwriting that ran to the edges of the page. Greta sat on her bunk and read it slowly, then read it again. Her parents' house had been destroyed in a bombing raid. Her father was dead. Her mother and sister were living in a basement with 6 other families. Food was scarce. Winter was coming. They ate grass soup, the letter said, burned furniture to stay warm, considered bread a luxury. Greta folded the letter carefully and held it in her lap. Around her, the barracks was quiet. The women had eaten dinner. They had blankets. They had medical care. Outside, generators hummed. Inside, bodies rested without fear of air raids. She felt the guilt settle in. Why was she safe while her family starved? She went to Captain Morrison the next day and asked if she could send food. He shook his head gently. "I wish I could say yes," he said. "But the mail barely gets through. Write to them. Let them know you're alive. That matters more than you think." So Greta wrote back. She told them she was healthy, that she was being treated well, that an American doctor had saved her life. She told them to hold on, that the war was truly over. She did not tell them how hard it was to sleep in a warm bed, knowing they did not have one. In February 1946, the announcement came. The women would be repatriated. The news was met with cheers and dread in equal measure. Home meant family, but also rubble, hunger, judgment. Some feared being called traitors for surviving. Others feared discovering there was nothing left to return to. On their final days at Camp Ruston, the women were given care packages: chocolate, soap, canned food, warm clothing, small things, heavy with meaning. Greta held the chocolate in her hands and stared at it for a long time. She had not tasted anything like it in years. She thought of her sister in Munich, of the basement, of the cold. When Captain Morrison came to say goodbye, Greta thanked him quietly. "For saving my life," she said, "and for showing me that strength doesn't have to look like cruelty." Morrison nodded. "Just remember it," he said. "That's enough." The women left Camp Ruston in March 1946. Trains carried them east. Ships carried them back across the Atlantic. Many clutched their care packages close, guarding them as if they were fragile treasures. Greta returned to Munich and found her mother and sister exactly where the letter had said they would be. She shared. The chocolate first. It helped them survive the winter. Greta told her story for the rest of her life. She told it to her children, then to her grandchildren. She told them about the day she stopped breathing, and the people she had been taught to fear refused to let her die. Years later, in an interview, Greta said simply, "I learned that propaganda is poison, and that mercy is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength." Germany had lost the war on the battlefield, but many Germans were defeated forever by something else: the humanity of the victor. America did not prove its strength by cruelty. It proved it by restraint, by law, by choice, by saving a life when it had every reason not to. These stories aren't about how America won the war, but about how America treated people when it had every reason not to. If that's worth remembering, subscribe.